There's that old parable about the drunk guy looking for his lost keys under a streetlight.
Yeah, yeah, the classic streetlight effect.
Exactly. So a stranger walks up and asks him where he dropped them. The guy points out into the pitch black night and says, like, over there in the dark, but the light is better over here.
Right, which is just human nature in a nutshell.
Totally. Well, today we are walking away from the light. We are heading straight into the dark to explore a text that essentially told the entire scientific community, that they were looking for the keys to human nature under the wrong streetlight.
And it really did tell them that. It was a massive shock to the system.
So the mission of this custom-tailored deep dive for you today is to explore one of the most foundational and, frankly, heavily controversial texts in evolutionary psychology.
Wow.
We're looking at Donald Symons' 1979 book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality.
And to understand why this book caused such an uproar, you really have to look at the historical context it was born into. Because in 1979, studying human sexuality from a biological or evolutionary perspective was basically an academic taboo.
Like completely off limits, right?
Completely.
Yeah.
Biologists had just ceded the territory. If you wanted to study sexual feelings, desires, fantasies, you left that to the sociologists, the anthropologists, the psychologists.
Because the running theory was what exactly?
The prevailing dogma was that our minds were just blank slates, completely shaped by culture and socialization. Evolutionary theory had revolutionized our understanding of almost every other aspect of animal life, but human intimacy. That was deemed totally separate from biology.
Right. And Symons, who was an anthropologist at UC Santa Barbara, he wanted to shatter that blank slate using the harsh lens of evolution. So for this deep dive, we're working from a comprehensive master summary of his book, along with some incredibly detailed excerpts that focus heavily on Chapter 6, which deals with sexual choice.
And the central, highly provocative thesis of this source material, the thing that really kicked the hornet's nest, is that there is a distinct male human nature and a distinct female human nature.
And that because of millions of years of evolution, they are extraordinarily different. It's not just culture, it's biology.
Exactly. But before we get into the actual mechanisms of that biology, we really need to set some ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, that is definitely important here.
Right. Our job as your guides today is to look objectively at what this text argues and, what its critics say in response. The goal isn't to endorse Symons' views or the views of his detractors.
We are not taking sides.
No, not at all. The goal is to deeply understand the evolutionary logic he proposed and exactly why it shook the academic world to its core.
Okay, so let's dive into that logic. The text anchors this entire theory on one brutal biological reality, which is the asymmetry of reproduction. To understand why Symons claims men and women are so fundamentally different in their desires, we have to look at parental investment.
Which is the bedrock of the whole theory.
Right. We know the physiological basics. Sperm is cheap, physically speaking, while pregnancy, lactation, and, years of childcare are incredibly resource-intensive. But Symons takes this basic biology and connects it to something he calls biologic.
Yeah, biologic. It's a great term. He defines it as an unconscious, evolved motivational structure. It shapes our deepest desires without us ever consciously thinking about it. And to explain it, Symons looks back to the Pleistocene era.
Also known as the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. Right?
Exactly. And he focuses on this specific era, not just as a random historical time period, but because that's when our brain spent millions of years evolving. It's the original environment our cognitive software was coded for, so to speak.
And in that environment, that massive difference in reproductive risk and investment forged two completely different psychological natures. Think of it like modern investing, right? For a male in the Pleistocene, a biological investment is like handing out a flyer on the street.
I love that analogy.
It's just, it costs almost nothing, physically speaking. So you give it to everyone, just hoping someone eventually visits your store. But for a female, it's like investing your entire life savings into a single, highly volatile startup.
Right. You aren't just handing that out to anyone walking by.
Exactly. You are going to research the CEO, analyze the market, assess the risks, verify long-term viability before you hand over a single dime. You simply have too much to lose to act recklessly.
And that maps perfectly onto what evolutionary psychologists call the motivational substructure. Because the physiological costs are so skewed, men evolved to seek variety.
Because handing out flyers pays off.
Right. Their biologic pushes them to be easily aroused, interested in novelty, and highly tolerant of risk. Because in that ancestral environment, random mating actually paid off reproductively. Women, conversely, evolved to be ruthlessly selective.
The startup investors.
Exactly. Their biologic prioritizes evidence of fitness, status, resources, a willingness to commit. A poor mate choice for an ancestral woman didn't just mean a bad date, it meant a disastrous blow to her reproductive success and, frankly, her survival.
Okay, so we have these two completely different sets of evolved desires, the flyer and the startup. But if women are so incredibly selective by nature, how did they actually go about choosing mates back in our ancestral environments?
Well, that's where the text takes a really counterintuitive turn in Chapter 6. It argues that often they didn't really get to choose at all.
Which feels like a huge contradiction, right?
It does, but Symons draws this crucial distinction between action and desire. If we look at preliterate societies as a model for our Pleistocene ancestors, marriages were rarely about personal romantic choice.
They were arranged.
Right, arranged by elders,
Oh,
particularly male elders. The text details practices in societies like the Tiwi tribe, where older men would essentially barter women, trading daughters to build intricate political alliances or even just secure other women for themselves.
and the text calls this a parent-offspring conflict because the elders are making decisions based on their own genetic and social interests, which completely diverge from the genetic interests of the young woman being married off.
Right. The father's priority might be securing an alliance with a powerful neighboring family, whereas the daughter's unconscious biological priority, or biologic, is finding the healthiest, most genetically fit, most invested partner to father her children.
And those two goals are rarely aligned.
Exactly. Elders relentlessly constrained the sexual activities and choices of the youth.
But hold on, wait. If elders controlled absolutely everything, and individuals, especially young women, had essentially no agency in who they married for millions of years, why would humans even evolve a psychology of sexual choice?
It's a great question.
Right, like why would we have these incredibly specific, deep-seated desires for certain traits in a partner? Wouldn't natural selection just mold us to be completely indifferent and passively accept whoever we were given?
You would think so. But evolution doesn't just design us for the everyday, inescapable routine. The mind plans for the rare and the difficult. Symons actually quotes thinkers like Proust and Montaigne here to illustrate that the human mind constantly lives in the future, assessing, simulating, planning.
So it's looking for a way out.
Yes, sexual experience, he argues, is adapted to the exceptional opportunity. Human social life, no matter how oppressive or heavily policed by elders, always provided a narrow scope for occasional evasions of the rules.
Meaning clandestine copulations, affairs.
Precisely. While your initial marriage might have been politically arranged, there was always a fleeting chance to arrange your own sexual partners outside of that constraint, or perhaps in subsequent marriages after a partner died.
Oh, wow. So desire evolved as this active, calculating assessor to help you make the absolute best genetic choice when that rare, dangerous window of opportunity briefly opened up.
Exactly. Your emotions are actively planning for the evasion of constraints.
That is wild. Our deepest romantic and sexual desires were forged in the evolutionary fires of having to sneak around. And that disconnect between what we are constrained to do and what we secretly desire is fascinating.
And the text argues it becomes blindingly obvious when you look at how the two sexes experience sexual arousal today.
Right, especially regarding visual stimuli. Which brings us to what the text calls the visual divide. This is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence Symons presents to argue against the blank slate theory.
Yeah, he introduces this concept of pornotopia.
Which sounds exactly like what it is. It's the text's term for the ultimate male fantasy realm. It's this imaginary world of sheer, unadulterated lust, completely devoid of tender feelings, complex courtships, or encumbering relationships. In Pornotopia, women are always instantly aroused and always willing.
And notice how that fantasy realm has remained largely unchanged for over a century. If you analyze Victorian-era underground erotica and compare it to modern internet pornography, they portray the exact same friction-free pornotopia.
It's just the flyer-handing reproductive strategy stripped of all real-world obstacles.
Exactly. Symons argues this isn't a cultural artifact. It reflects basic, unfiltered male wishes that lie much closer to the genes than everyday social behavior does.
Now, if men and women really are just blank slates, shaped equally by the surrounding culture, then giving women the exact same visual stimuli should yield the exact same response, right?
That was the assumption, yeah.
The text highlights an amazing natural experiment from the 1970s involving Playgirl and Viva magazines to test this. Following the sexual revolution, publishers assumed women were just culturally repressed. They figured if they created mainstream magazines featuring nude men for heterosexual women, they would sell just like Playboy.
It provided a perfect real-world test case for Symons's biologic, and the data from that era heavily supported his thesis.
You'd think giving women their own version of Playboy would be a massive financial hit. But Viva magazine actually had to stop publishing male nudes entirely by 1976 because their female readers actively disliked them.
They actually disliked them.
Yeah. The editor explicitly stated that photographs of nude males were distasteful to many of their female readers. Supermarkets refused to stock it, and polling showed women were far less approving of visual nudity than men.
And Playgirl faced similar structural issues. According to the text, it relied heavily on a gay male readership just to stay financially afloat. A study of college students evaluating Playgirl versus Playboy found that 74% of the women rated the sexual stimulation of the male nudes on the lower half of the scale.
And a full third said it wasn't stimulating in the slightest.
Right, because when heterosexual women do look at erotica, the text argues the mechanism of arousal is entirely different. Researchers like John Money and Anka Earhart suggested that when a man looks at a female nude, he objectifies her. He mentally isolates her from the context and imagines copulating with her.
But when a woman is aroused by a picture, she typically subjectively identifies with the female in the image as an object of desire. She projects herself into the emotional and physical scenario, rather than simply objectifying the male body on the page.
Which brings us to the underlying physiological mechanisms of arousal. The text highlights a fascinating study by researcher Julia Hyman that physically measured these differences.
Okay, this is my absolute favorite detail from the source material. Hyman had male and female college students listen to different audio tapes, some erotic, some romantic, and one control tape.
The control tape is the best part.
Right. While they listened, researchers physically measured their arousal by tracking changes in blood volume. Both men and women responded, as expected, to the explicitly erotic tapes. But the control tape is where it gets surreal.
It really does.
The control tape was a totally bland, non-sexual recording of a student couple discussing the academic benefits of majoring in anthropology versus pre-med.
And the physiological data showed that male subjects experienced significant arousal to this incredibly boring, non-sexual conversation. The female subjects experienced none.
None at all.
In fact, at one point in the data, the average male response to the anthropology control tape was actually stronger than the strongest female response to the explicitly erotic tape. Hyman noted she always suspected men could interpret the most unsexy, mundane situations as erotic, and there it was, quantified in the blood volume data.
Hey, nice textbook, want to major in anthropology? And their biologic just hits the alarm bells. But why? Why are men wired with such a hair trigger to be aroused by literally just the presence of a woman talking about college majors, while women require such a complex array of inputs?
Well, it comes right back to asymmetry of reproductive costs. For a Pleistocene male, missing a reproductive opportunity is a permanent genetic loss, a false negative. But false positive getting aroused when there is no actual opportunity costs very little energy.
Just a wasted flyer.
Exactly. Therefore, natural selection favored a male psychology that is easily triggered by almost any female visual or contextual cue. For a female, a false positive is disastrous. Random mating with an unverified partner carries a massive physical and genetic cost.
A bad startup investment.
Right, so natural selection aggressively disfavored female arousal, strictly to visual cues of male bodies. Women require evidence of fitness, status, and actual interpersonal interaction before arousal kicks in, because their biologic demands they evaluate the quality of the investment first.
It makes so much sense when you frame it that way, but if arousal and desire are just these evolutionary subroutines, Symons applied that same unromantic biological lens to every other aspect of human intimacy, which brings us to the most explosive parts of the text. Because when you claim biology drives behavior, you inevitably collide with deeply held cultural and moral beliefs.
And Symons definitely touched on topics in 1979 that remain fiercely debated battlegrounds today.
So I want to explicitly remind you, the listener, as we move into these controversies, our job here is to impartially report what is in the source material and how critics responded. We are not endorsing any political, ideological, or academic stance. We are just exploring the architectural arguments of evolutionary psychology and the intense pushback they received.
And the first major fault line Symons exposed was his explanation of the female orgasm. He dedicated an entire chapter to arguing that the female orgasm is not actually an evolutionary adaptation at all.
Which is wild. He classified it as an artifact, right? A byproduct.
Yes, His evolutionary logic was grounded in functionalism. In males, orgasm is clearly adaptive because it is physically required for the release of sperm, and thus reproduction. But women can, and often do, conceive without experiencing orgasm.
Right.
Symons argued that if it were a true adaptation, it would serve a specific, necessary reproductive function, which he claimed lacked empirical evidence. Therefore, he argued it's a byproduct of the early embryonic developmental program shared with males.
Just developmental echo.
Basically. Just as men have nipples which serve no reproductive function but exist because of a shared genetic blueprint before sexual differentiation, women have the physiological capacity for orgasm.
But hold on, the sheer complexity of it makes that hard to swallow. Critics fiercely oppose this artifact theory. If it's just a useless byproduct like male nipples, why does it have such a profound physiological, neurological, and emotional impact?
That's a massive point of contention.
Right. Doesn't the intricate neurochemistry involved, like the massive release of oxytocin, suggest it has to serve some evolutionary purpose? Like, I don't know, promoting pair bonding and keeping partners together to raise slow-growing human infants?
That is exactly the counterargument. Critics point to evidence that it promotes strong pair bonding, which is crucial for offspring survival. Others point to the sperm retention hypothesis, suggesting the muscular contractions of orgasm act as a mechanism to retain the sperm of preferred, high-quality males. They argue Symons fundamentally misunderstood female physiology by trying to map male reproductive utility directly onto it.
So that's controversy number one. Now, for controversy number two, Symons needed a way to prove that his model of a relentless male desire for sexual variety wasn't just a cultural artifact or just a reaction to female choosiness. So he looked for an environment where female selectivity was completely removed from the equation. He used male homosexuality as a test case.
And his logic here was highly controversial.
Yeah.
He hypothesized that promiscuous male homosexuals, because they are interacting exclusively with other males and are completely unconstrained by female selective biologic, showcase raw, unfiltered male sexual psychology.
Okay, I see where he's going.
Right. The intense desire for variety, the heavy reliance on visual arousal, the casualness of encounters, he argued this is exactly what heterosexual male sexuality would look like if women weren't setting the stringent terms of the reproductive exchange.
But you can't just subtract the woman and assume the male mind operates identically, right? The pushback here is that this logic relies on a strange sort of blank slate assumption of its own.
It really does.
Critics argue it is a massive logical leap to assume that homosexual psychology is perfectly identical to heterosexual psychology, just minus the female partner. It ignores the possibility that homosexuality has its own unique evolutionary pathway and psychological architecture. You can't just map one demographic directly onto another to use as a convenient control group.
Absolutely. And that collision of biological theory and cultural sensitivity reaches its absolute peak in the darkest corner of the text. The most explosive argument Symons made was his evolutionary explanation of rape.
Yeah, this is heavy. At the time, prevailing feminist theories and many mainstream sociological theories argued that rape is a crime solely about power, control, and violence, and has absolutely nothing to do with sex or sexual desire.
And Symons directly contradicted this. He argued that from an evolutionary standpoint, rape is an explicable byproduct of male psychological adaptations. Remember, male reproductive success in the Pleistocene rewarded relentless sexual persistence.
Handing out those flyers.
Right. It also rewarded physical aggression when competing with other males for resources or status. Symons argued that when a male is denied long-intimate mating opportunities, these two distinct adaptations, the intense desire for sexual variety and the capacity for aggression, can misfire and combine violently, producing this horrific byproduct.
But does explaining something biologically mean we are justifying it? Because this is the core ethical tension of the entire book. If a behavior is described as natural or an evolved byproduct, it sounds an awful lot like the text is saying it's inevitable, or worse, that it's okay.
And this touches on the naturalistic fallacy, the deeply ingrained human tendency to conflate what is with what ought to be. Our brains intuitively assume that if something is biologically natural, it is somehow good or justified.
Which isn't true.
No, not at all. The text's stance and the defense mounted by evolutionary psychologists is a resounding no. Explaining the ultimate evolutionary causation of a behavior is absolutely not the same as excusing it. Symons was trying to understand the machinery of the behavior so it could be addressed.
But critics didn't see it that way.
They accused him of biological determinism. They argued that by framing male violence as an evolutionary byproduct, he was inherently excusing it and providing scientific cover for sexism. The profound fear was, and honestly still is, that if society believes a behavior is biological, people will throw their hands up, say it can't be changed, and just stop trying to improve society.
Which perfectly sets up the enduring legacy of this book. We are looking at a text that is nearly half a century old, yet the fault lines it exposed are still intensely active today. The evolution of human sexuality forced both society and the academic world to confront an incredibly uncomfortable possibility.
That our biology is driving the bus.
Exactly. That our most intimate feelings, our romantic longings, and our darkest impulses might not just be the product of bad movies, cultural conditioning, or socialization. They might be firmly rooted in millions of years of biological hardware.
It essentially laid the foundation for the entire modern field of evolutionary psychology. It demanded that we stop looking for the keys under the streetlight of culture alone.
Whether you agree with the book's stark conclusions or see them as deeply flawed and overly deterministic, its impact is undeniable. And it's totally relevant to you listening right now. Think about your own life. Every time you swipe left or right on a dating app based on a split-second visual cue.
Right, that's biologic in action.
Every time you feel a sudden, irrational spark of jealousy. Every time you evaluate a potential partner's career prospects, their physical symmetry, or their willingness to commit, you might not just be making a modern conscious choice. You might be running ancient biological software, perfectly coded for a Pleistocene environment where survival and reproduction were constantly on a nice edge.
And the text ultimately makes a profound point about human plasticity. We have an incredible flexibility to learn, adapt, and build complex cultures. But Symons warns that plasticity is a double-edged sword. Social engineering and cultural ideals cannot entirely overwrite our evolved differences. We are not infinitely malleable blank slates.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. If Symons is even partially right, and there is a non-negotiable evolutionary substructure underneath our modern lives, when we try to build modern relationships and social policies based on the idealized cultural notion that men and women are exactly identical in their desires, their arousal patterns, and their biologic, are we setting ourselves up for failure? By ignoring this text, are we just exhausting ourselves fighting against our own evolutionary shadows?
That's the million-dollar question.
It really is the ultimate challenge of trying to find the truth in the dark rather than just looking where the light makes us feel comfortable. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material.